credits, we're diving into Obsession, the horror thriller from Curry Barker that turns Fixation into something much darker.
Yeah, and darker is honestly an understatement with this one.
It really is. I mean, imagine walking into this, like, dusty, dimly lit crystal shop, right? And you find this retro novelty toy that guarantees the person you desire will never, ever leave you.
On paper, that sounds exactly like the setup for, a quirky romantic comedy.
Exactly. But what if it actually worked? What if you forced someone into loving you and then you just had to live with the suffocating reality of what you've done to their mind?
It's such a heavy, terrifying concept.
It really is. And for those of you listening right now, we've tailored this deep dive specifically for you. We're going to unpack this massive indie horror hit, and we're keeping it spoiler light so we don't ruin the major twists.
Right. Plenty of tension without giving away the ghost, so to speak.
Exactly. We're going to look at the psychology of the nice guy trope, the actual, like, brutal realities of low-budget filmmaking, and the incredibly clever ways the director manipulates your brain to build this unrelenting tension.
Because it really is a fascinating psychological experiment, just disguised as a thriller. The setup feels so familiar, almost comforting, which is, well, it's a very intentional trap.
So let's set that trap for the listener. The story follows Bear. He works at a music store. He's super quiet, and he's grieving the recent death of his cat.
Yeah, poor guy.
Right. He just seems like a gentle, unassuming guy, and he harbors this really intense, unspoken crush on his coworker, Nikki. But instead of just, asking her out like a normal person, he buys this object called the One Wish Willow.
And he wishes that Nikki would love him more than anyone else in the world.
Yeah. And the wish is granted. But what follows isn't romance. It is a grueling exploration of unearned affection.
The origin of this concept is what really hooked me, honestly. Because when you look at where the writer and director Curry Barker got the idea, it wasn't from reading dense psychological thrillers.
Yeah, where did he get it?
He was literally sitting on a couch with his friends, watching a rerun of The Simpsons.
Are you serious? The Simpsons? That is such a wild source of inspiration for a movie this bleak.
Right. It was specifically the Treehouse of Horror, this segment, the one that parodies the classic monkey's paw fable. That comedic take on a wish going horribly wrong, it just planted a seed for him.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the monkey's paw trope is so enduring because it deals with the perversion of human desire. You ask the universe for something, the universe gives it to you on a technicality, and the hidden cost makes you regret you ever even opened your mouth.
And the mechanism for that curse here is such a brilliant physical prop. Barker and his mother, who is actually a graphic designer, they created the One Wish Willow themselves.
That's so cool that they did that together.
Yeah, and they deliberately avoided making it a standard square box. They went with this distinct triangular shape with a really retro, 1970s aesthetic. It feels completely disconnected from our modern world, like something that just shouldn't exist.
And the design was so effective, Focus Features actually produced real replicas to sell online.
Yes, and they vanished instantly. Now people are trying to flip them on eBay for like $200.
Wow. $200 for a cursed triangle.
Basically, yeah. But, looking past the cool merchandise aspect, the thematic weight of that little triangle is just crushing. It's fundamentally about bodily autonomy.
Oh, completely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the movie uses this magical trope to really hold a mirror up to a very real modern issue.
What do you mean?
Well, if you strip away the supernatural element, what are you left with? You have a metaphor for toxic codependency and this whole cultural conversation around the male loneliness epidemic.
Right. Yeah.
Bear feels this inherent entitlement to Nikki's time and affection, but he bypasses the actual work of vulnerability. He skips the part where you build trust. And because of the spell, Nikki is entirely stripped of her ability to consent.
She really is.
She is basically imprisoned in her own mind. Her free will is completely overwritten by his loneliness.
I hear that, but I'm actually going to push back on how we categorize Bear for a second. I know he's portrayed as this sad, grieving guy who just lost his pet, but it's like he's forcing someone to perform the lead role in a play she never auditioned for.
That's a great way to put it.
He's dictating her emotions. So does knowing that Bear is actively turning a blind eye to Nikki's suffering make him the ultimate secret villain of the movie?
That is exactly the uncomfortable space the film wants you to sit in. Michael Johnston, the actor who plays Bear, he actually mentioned he was drawn to the role specifically because Bear isn't some mustache-twirling antagonist who revels in evil.
Oh, right. He's just a guy.
He is defined by his profound cowardice. He sees the damage he's doing. He sees the monster he's created. But he chooses willful blindness because the fantasy is currently serving his needs. He doesn't attempt to intervene until the situation escalates to literal tragedy.
Which honestly makes him way more insidious to me than a traditional slasher villain.
Oh, absolutely.
Because a slasher villain is like a force of nature. Bear is just a guy who refuses to take responsibility for his own mess.
Exactly. His evil is deeply rooted in inaction. But to make that dynamic actually work, to make us really feel the weight of his selfishness, the victim's suffering has to feel incredibly grounded. And that brings us to Inde Navarrette's performance as Nikki.
Oh, we have to talk about Freaky Nikki. That's what the crew called her on set, and it is so fitting. Navarrette had to physically manifest the reality of this curse. If she doesn't sell the internal nightmare of being trapped in your own body, the entire premise just falls flat.
Completely. And she had some very specific reference points for the role. She looked closely at Mia Goth in the movie Pearl to study how an actor can humanize a character while simultaneously pushing them to this level of terrifying, almost grotesque intensity.
Oh, wow. Yeah, Pearl's a great reference for that.
She also channeled Florence Pugh's performance in Midsommar.
The crying scenes.
Yes. If you remember that film, Pugh has these visceral, ugly, full-body crying scenes. Navarrette tapped into that raw, helpless grief to communicate that Nikki's soul is basically screaming from the inside, even if her body's complying with the wish.
That is so intense. And Michael Johnston brought his own unscripted depth to counter that intensity, right? He built this whole backstory, like this personal lore for Bear, to explain why he is so isolated.
Yeah, the pills.
Exactly. Early in the film, you see Bear taking pills. The script didn't actually specify what they were, but Johnston decided they were his late grandmother's oxycodone. Bear is living in her old house. His cat just died. He has no friends. He is self-medicating his profound emptiness.
And that choice completely informs how he carries his body in the film. He's heavy. He's weighed down by this incredible inertia.
And that inertia led to this unbelievable moment of improvisation on set. There is a one-take scene in the bathroom where Bear is supposed to swallow those pills, really resigning himself to the dark path he's on.
But he doesn't, right?
No. When they rolled the camera, Johnston felt that fully committing to the pills was just too decisive for a guy like Bear, because Bear is a coward. So entirely unscripted, Johnston shoves his fingers down his throat, trying to choke the pills back up at the very last second.
Oh, man.
But he can't even commit to throwing them up. He just gags and accepts it.
It is such a pathetic, deeply humanizing moment. He lacks the conviction to be fully good, and he lacks the stomach to be fully evil. He just drifts. But while Johnston was building Bear's internal cowardice, Navarrette came up with a physical rule for Nikki that changes the entire landscape of the movie's horror. She pitched an idea that during intimate scenes, or really any time Bear's gaze leaves Nikki's face, her expression should go entirely, terrifyingly blank.
Ugh, that is such a deeply unsettling visual.
What's fascinating here is the underlying logic. It operates exactly like a video game rendering engine.
Wait, explain that for the listener. How does a video game engine relate to a magical curse?
So in video game design, there's a concept called frustum culling.
Frustum culling.
Yeah. To save memory, the game only renders the graphics that the player's camera is currently looking at. If you turn your character around, the world behind you essentially ceases to exist until you look at it again.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right, so Navarrette applied that logic to the spell. The spell's sole purpose is to perform for Bear. So if Bear isn't looking at Nikki's face, the spell doesn't waste energy generating an emotion. It just shuts down. It is the ultimate objectification. The moment she leaves his line of sight, she ceases to be a feeling entity.
Okay, let's unpack this. I love that you brought up that mechanism because it explains what I think is the most terrifying scene in the movie. Bear leaves the house to run an errand, and the audience is briefly shown what Nikki does when she's alone.
Oh, this part is so creepy.
She doesn't watch TV. She doesn't read. She just walks to the front door and stands completely motionless, like a power-down machine or, a dog waiting for its owner. It is so skin-crawling. Why does that total stillness mess with our brains so much more than someone running around with a knife?
It's because stillness violates our fundamental understanding of human nature. Humans are inherently dynamic creatures. We shift our weight, we blink, our eyes dart around, we breathe visibly.
Yeah, we're always moving a little bit.
Exactly. When you are presented with a human being who is as static as a piece of furniture, it triggers this deep evolutionary alarm bell in your brain. It signals that something is fundamentally wrong. It forces you to sit in the discomfort of Nikki's erased humanity.
And that feeling of being trapped, of humanity being like squeezed out of the frame, isn't just in the acting. You literally feel boxed in when you watch this movie, which brings us to how Barker actually shot it.
The visual language of the film is remarkably strict.
Mm.
With the exception of one single frame, the entire narrative is locked into Bear's perspective. If Bear doesn't see it, we don't see it.
And to make that perspective feel even more oppressive, Barker made a highly unconventional choice with the camera's aspect ratio. Most movies you see in the theater are wide and cinematic, right? Barker chose to shoot this in a 3.2 ratio.
Which is so narrow.
Yeah. For context, if you pull out your smartphone right now and take a standard photo, that is a 3.2 ratio. It's slightly narrower, a bit taller. He combined that rigid frame with very static, center-focused shots. So when you watch the movie, it feels like you are swiping through a photo album of Bear's life.
It creates a tremendous visual claustrophobia.
Mm.
You are boxed into this narrower frame, which perfectly mirrors how Nikki is boxed into Bear's life.
Yeah.
There is no peripheral vision. There is no escape. And it's worth noting where Barker developed this instinct for framing and pacing. He didn't come up through traditional film school horror.
He didn't?
No, he cut his teeth doing YouTube sketch comedy.
Wait, really? Which sounds so counterintuitive, right? Comedy and psychological horror feel like total polar opposites.
They seem like opposites on the surface, but mechanically they utilize the exact same muscle group. Both genres rely entirely on the manipulation of tension and release.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, a comedian builds expectation and subverts it with a punchline to elicit a laugh. A horror director builds expectation and subverts it with a scare to elicit a scream. It is all about mastering timing to trigger an involuntary reaction from the audience.
Barker actually talked about this. He said his comedy editing instincts taught him to prioritize honesty over cheap jump scares. And my absolute favorite example of this is a scene where Nikki is acting incredibly creepy.
The bedroom scene.
Yes, she is just standing in the dark corner of their bedroom staring. In a standard Hollywood horror movie, you know exactly what happens next. The music drops out, the protagonist slowly walks toward the dark corner, and then bang, a loud noise and a jump scare.
Classic horror trope.
But how does Bear react? He asks her to come to bed. She doesn't answer, so he just sighs, rolls over, and goes to sleep.
Which is honestly what an exhausted, somewhat oblivious guy would do in real life.
Exactly. It gets a huge laugh from a theater audience because it's so relatable, but then the laughter just dies in your throat because the implication is so unnerving. He is so used to her unnatural behavior that he can just sleep through it.
It really lulls the audience into a false sense of security. But Barker pairs that visual restraint with a very aggressive auditory experience. Barker actually composed the creepy One Wish Willow song himself.
Really? How did he do that?
He literally just tapped it out on his phone using a music app called Oxy. But the broader sound design is the real secret weapon of the film.
Let's unpack that because sound is so often overlooked in indie films.
Well, Barker received some incredibly valuable advice from director Zach Kreger, who had previously learned this from the legendary David Fincher.
Oh, wow, Fincher. That's good company.
Right. The advice was simple. A film's budget is truly felt in the sound mix. You can shoot a movie on a cheap digital camera, but if your sound design is massive, the movie feels massive to the audience.
And the sound design here is mixed in Dolby Atmos. For the listener, Dolby Atmos is a spatial audio technology. So instead of sound just coming from the left or right speakers, it treats sounds as individual objects that can move anywhere in a three-dimensional space, including right above your head.
It's so immersive.
It is. You hear a floorboard creak in the back left corner of the ceiling. It takes a filmmaker who shot his previous movie for literally $800 and elevates his new project to a level where Focus Features buys it for a reported $15 million. The sound makes a small room feel like a massive, terrifying world.
But going back to that restrictive 3.2 camera frame for a moment, the sound is massive, but the visual perspective is so incredibly narrow. We are trapped in Bear's subjective reality.
Right. By forcing the audience into Bear's exact point of view, does Barker make us complicit in his toxic fantasy?
I really think he does. For the first half of the runtime, we only have his context. We inherently want to believe he's a good guy because he's our avatar. We project our own empathy onto him.
That makes total sense.
So when the horrifying reality of what he's done finally sets in, the audience feels a profound sense of betrayal. And it isn't just a betrayal by the character. We feel betrayed by our own initial sympathy for him. We enable the nice guy narrative right up until the psychological tension violently snaps.
And when it snaps, it is not a quiet, cerebral break. the movie shifts gears into brutal physical reality. Which brings us to the actual production of those moments. Because for a movie so focused on quiet, claustrophobic tension, the physical stunts are shocking.
They really are.
Indy Navarrete insisted on doing her own stunts, and there's a sequence where her character, fully unhinged by the spell, is on rollerblades. She skates at full speed and intentionally smashes her head completely through a car window.
You really have to imagine the stress of that day on set. They're an indie production working on a very tight schedule and an even tighter budget. They couldn't afford infinite retakes. The prop department only had 3 pieces of breakaway candy glass for that window.
And they started losing them immediately, right?
Yes. The first piece of candy glass literally shattered while they were just carefully carrying it to the car.
Oh, no.
Then the second piece was ruined during a take because a random piece of styrofoam fell into the camera frame.
That is brutal. So the entire sequence came down to one final piece of glass.
Exactly. One take left.
And Navarrete is on rollerblades, wearing a bulky wig and a safety helmet that severely limits her peripheral vision. The pressure on an actor in that moment is immense. If she misses the mark, the shoot is ruined, and she just charges at the car and absolutely nails it on the final attempt.
That level of practical physical execution really grounds the psychological horror. You aren't watching a CGI window break. You're watching an actor throw her weight into a physical object. And Barker carried that commitment to grueling realism right into the ensuing murder scene.
Yeah, that scene is intense.
They used entirely practical effects. The special effects team rigged a 15-pound dummy head with blood tubes. Navarrete had to straddle it and repeatedly hit it with a foam brick. And Barker made a very deliberate directorial choice. He refused to yell cut.
He just let the camera roll and let her keep swinging.
He wanted the physical exhaustion to be palpable. Hitting something repeatedly with force is exhausting. As the take dragged on, her arm grew tired. Her swings got realistically slower, heavier, and more labored. He forces both the audience and Bear to sit there and watch the unglamorous, grueling reality of violence. It isn't slick or choreographed, it's ugly.
But that commitment to showing the ugly reality actually caused a massive headache with the Motion Picture Association.
Oh, it did. This raises an important question about industry pushback, because the MPA actually threatened the film with an NC-17 rating.
And for the listener who might not follow industry politics, an NC-17 rating is essentially a death sentence for a movie's financial success. Most major theater chains won't screen them, and a lot of outlets won't run advertising for them.
Right, it's a huge deal.
So Barker's back was against the wall. He had to trim several of those grueling head smashes from that exact sequence just to secure an R rating. He was understandably furious at first, especially because crowds at the early film festivals loved the raw, uncut version.
It's a constant friction in modern horror, honestly. How does a filmmaker balance the need to push the boundaries of the genre, which Barker has stated is his primary creative goal, with the strict commercial realities of theater distribution?
It's tough.
It is a tightrope walk between maintaining your artistic integrity and ensuring your movie actually gets seen. Barker later admitted that the trimmed version works just as well for the pacing of the scene, though he has teased that an unrated director's cut might eventually see the light of day.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. I think what makes Barker such an exciting director is that he doesn't let those hurdles paralyze him. He fully embraces the chaos and the happy accidents of indie filmmaking.
Oh, completely.
Because beyond the stress of the stunt glass and the MPA battles, there was the most notoriously disgusting day on set. They had to shoot a practical projectile vomit scene.
Gross.
Yeah, the props department mixed up this foul concoction of bananas, sugar, chocolate, and oatmeal. And during the take, the rigged hose slipped out of position, and the fake vomit shot directly into Navarrete's mouth.
On a sterile, big-budget studio film that would immediately halt production, people would panic, the actor would hit their trailer.
But here, it just became part of the raw, chaotic energy of the scene. They adapted.
And that willingness to adapt even extended to the very end of the story. The conclusion of the film was actually a product of on-set discovery. Barker has revealed in interviews that his original script had a very different, very dark ending.
What was it originally?
Originally, Nikki was going to kill herself to finally escape the purgatory of the wish.
Which on paper feels like the logical, bleak conclusion to being trapped like that.
It does. But while they were filming the climax, Barker decided on the fly to shoot one alternate take. He wanted to see what it would look like if she survives the carnage instead.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and when they got to the editing room and watched the footage back, they had a realization. The visual of Nikki surviving screaming, fully aware, and being forced to live with the horrific aftermath of what the spell commanded her body to do was actually a far more punishing, terrifying outcome than the release of death.
That is so dark.
So they scrapped the scripted ending and changed it entirely.
Which is the magic of the indie hustle. You find the movie while you're making the movie. So after unpacking the trivia, the practical gore, the restrictive camera angles, and the psychological weight of it all, what is the core takeaway for you, the listener? I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
Early in the film, before the magic toy ruins everyone's lives, Nikki is talking about a novel she's trying to write. During this conversation, she argues that there is a distinct difference between a romance and a love story.
Right, I remember that scene.
A romance, she says, requires reciprocation. It requires mutuality and an equal exchange of vulnerability. But obsession is entirely one-sided. It only requires one person's desires. So if you think about it, perhaps the truest horror of this movie isn't the cursed wooden triangle or the bloody practical stunts. It's the unsettling realization of how many people in the real world are unknowingly trapped, playing supporting characters in someone else's deeply selfish love story.
It is a really sobering thought. It proves that the scariest monsters aren't supernatural creatures hiding under the bed. They are the unchecked desires of the people sitting right next to us.
And that wraps our deep dive into obsession. If you enjoyed this episode, follow Roll Credits and share it with your fellow movie fans. And let us know what film we should cover next, old or new. We'll be back soon with more trivia, more movie magic, and maybe a few more sleepless nights.